Well, hello there. This is Rachel Dudley. I'm here to explain to you a story. A story that hopefully you will care about. In 15th century Japan, during the Ashikaga Bakufu, under the reign of Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa, 1436 through 1490, as the story goes, the shogun, Yoshimasa, had just broken one of his favorite celadon tea bowls. This particular tea bowl was significant. It had been a gift from Busho Zenji, or the master of Zen Buddhism, to Taira no Shigemori, in return for a donation of gold during the Heian, or Golden Period, circa 1175. This is according to documentation authored by Confucian scholar Ito Togai during the Edo period, circa 1721. Note that this story is being told, or at least documented, for what seems to be the first time, more than 500 years after the fact. When it broke, Yoshimasa sent it to China, its home of origin, in hopes of exchanging it with another of the same quality. However, China was unable to replace the bowl at that time, stating, quote, "We regret to inform you that tea bowls from our wildly popular Celadon line have been discontinued due to an ongoing material shortage. We hope you will kindly accept your original tea bowl back, which we have taken the liberty of fixing with some rusty staples. Should be good as new now." End quote. Predictably, this did not please the shogun, so the shogun implored local lacquerware craftsmen to come up with a more elegant repair. As a result, Kintsugi was born. But hang on a second, you might be saying to yourself right now. I heard that Kintsugi started with the samurai Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the 16th century CE. His servant was preparing his tea and dropped and broke his favorite tea bowl. And then, before Hideyoshi could punish the attendant, probably with something harsh and extreme like a public beheading, the tea master Yusai Hosokawa intervened, gluing the pieces back together with gold-gilded lacquer. It would seem that the veracity of either story is highly debatable, and none of the details can be proven unequivocally. In fact, the bowl believed to have been featured in the first version of history, the one with Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa at the center, is known as the Bakohan Bowl and is currently housed at the Tokyo National Museum. But clearly, this bowl does not prove itself to be an example of the Japanese Kintsugi technique specifically. But instead, it still proudly wears its sutures that belie its likely repair in China, using then traditional Chinese repair techniques. It is, however, interesting to note that, just as with modern-day pottery that has been repaired with Kintsugi, the Bakohan bowl became more valuable as a result of its repair. Its common name refers entirely to the form that the repair took. Bakohan translates directly to large locust clamp. So even though evidence exists to suggest that these stories are not entirely accurate, still, various iterations of each seem to float around without challenge. So why have these stories been told as they have, despite the obvious inaccuracies? And why do they continue to be repeated? Does the backstory of Kintsugi even matter? To better understand what role the legend of Kintsugi may have played in the development of modern-day Japanese culture, including architectural design, we will examine its context at 4 scales. First, extra large, we will look at this technique through a wide-angle lens, exploring the philosophical thought behind it and the overarching history of Japan. Next, we will zoom in a bit to the large scale and consider how the philosophies and conversations that occurred contemporaneously with the development of Kintsugi also inform the choices of city planning and urban development. Then we will consider the medium scale and see how a unique Japanese aesthetic, informed by these same conversations, came to be realized in both residential and public architecture alike. Finally, we'll circle back around to the legend of Kintsugi at the small scale to see if we can draw any conclusions and answer these questions. Also known as kintsukuroi, kintsugi translates to golden joinery, or golden repair. Kintsugi is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery in a manner that highlights and even celebrates what clearly has been an event of trauma in the life of an inanimate object. It is a metaphor of triumph, a metaphor for the value of not just perseverance amidst imperfection, but in fact defiance towards the very notion. It is a deeply complicated and moving form of functional art that has endured for centuries. Kintsugi demonstrates and reinforces many important cultural values and philosophies that have successfully persisted throughout centuries. The persistence of these philosophies is particularly remarkable considering the unique environmental and socio-political challenges that this country has navigated over the same time period. Consequently, the values that inform Kintsugi have also informed a uniquely identifiable Japanese aesthetic that reveals itself in all aspects of their culture, including their architecture and built environment. Logistically, Kintsugi is accomplished using lacquer as an interstitial compound to rejoin the remnants of a broken piece of ceramic or earthenware. Lacquer is made from the sap of the urushi tree. This sap is toxic to humans in its unprocessed form, but once heated becomes very similar to plastic in its material properties. The origin of using lacquer to create durable household goods is difficult to trace precisely because it's so old. But the world's oldest known Japanese lacquer product is a decorative item from around 9,000 years ago, which places its creation around the middle of what is now known as the Jomon period. The Jomon period in Japan lasted from approximately 14,000 to 300 BCE. Its name derives from the characteristic cord markings that are displayed by pottery from this period. Sociologically, this period was characterized by scattered Neolithic hunter-gatherer communities that were primarily concentrated and distributed along the coastal areas of Japan. Although lacquerware as a technique seems to have developed some 7,000 years after evidence of the earliest pottery, it is clear that both pottery and lacquer have had a critical role in the development of Japan. Philosophically, this technique perfectly embodies the complexity of Japanese thought, particularly around the nature of human existence, uncertainty, impermanence, and a cultivated sense of beauty in imperfection. Of foundational importance to understanding the depth of Kintsugi's symbolism for the Japanese people is the concept of mono no aware. Translating as the pathos, or a quality that evokes sadness, of things, this describes a basic philosophical orientation to our experience of living in an impermanent world. One of the strongest examples of the impact of mono no aware on contemporary Japan can be observed in their relationship to the cherry tree, particularly during its blossoming season. Each year, the Japanese people observe the progression of the blossoming as it moves from the southern end of Honshu toward the north and into Hokkaido. The timing of the blossoming in any given location depends fully on the weather over the preceding winter. The Japan Meteorological Corporation publishes and updates an official forecast as the season progresses. The arrival of the blossoms is celebrated throughout the country with hanami, or flower viewing, and sakura matsuris, cherry blossom festivals. These events must be exceedingly well timed due to the excruciatingly finite nature of the cherry tree's delicate blossoms. The blossoms last a maximum of 1 week, plus if weather is adverse on the days of blooming. In this way, the blossoms of the cherry trees are even more highly valued in Japan than that of other fruit trees, precisely because of the power with which they demonstrate mono no aware. Although a formal definition of Japanese aesthetics would not arise until the 19th century, Kintsugi and other similar long-standing cultural practices, for example, the tea ceremony, ikebana, calligraphy, ukiyo-e, or woodblock print art, eagerly reveal the nuanced worldview of the Japanese people, developed over centuries. Kintsugi is strongly associated with wabi-sabi, a Japanese aesthetic ideal originating from two distinct Zen Buddhism concepts. Direct translation of these concepts is difficult, but it is commonly considered that wabi is closely aligned with the concept of simple, austere beauty, and sabi describes an authentic state of patina. Together they form a sentiment focused on bringing to mind the fleeting nature of human existence, and generally means something like to find beauty in broken things. Wabi-sabi has been so important to Japanese aesthetics for so long that Leonard Cohen cites it as being akin to the Greek ideals of beauty and perfection in the West. Richard Powell writes, Wabi-sabi nurtures all that is authentic by acknowledging three simple realities. Nothing lasts, nothing is finished, and nothing is perfect. Zen Buddhist philosophies, first informed by Confucian principles, are in no small part responsible for the integration and internalizing of philosophies like wabi-sabi and mono no aware into the Japanese way of being. Yoshida Kenko, a Buddhist priest and philosopher from the 14th century, wrote in his Essays in Idleness, quote, "It does not matter how young or strong you may be, the hour of death comes sooner than you expect. It is an extraordinary miracle that you should have escaped to this day. Do you suppose you have even the briefest respite in which to relax?" The internalized identity of the Japanese person was further informed by Confucius thinking because this considered humans as basic social units who must respect and be in harmony with nature. Yet living in harmony with nature was not always easy for the Japanese. Their history demonstrates a progression of upheavals brought about by natural disasters like earthquakes, tsunamis, volcano eruptions, fire, drought, and famine. Still, evidence suggests that even thousands of years ago, the hunter-gatherer tribes of the Jomon period were known to be unusually sedentary, as far as hunter-gatherers go, thanks in large part to the plentiful gifts that their natural environment offered. Due to volcanic activity, their soil is incredibly rich and fertile. Due to their proximity to the ocean, their diet is high in omega-6 fatty acids and other readily available and dense sources of nutrition. Due to their location along the Ring of Fire, geothermal activity provides ready access to hot water. So, from this perspective, it is easy to understand why philosophies such as mono no aware and wabi-sabi became so critical in this culture. The Japanese people were constantly required to face head-on the full range of emotions associated with the human experience, not just at the individual level, but also as a population. These philosophies became highly adaptive emotional tools, critical to survival, given an existence of such strong opposites. In the 15th century, when Yoshimasa's version of the Kintsugi story is said to have taken place, life in Japan was markedly dichotomous and complex. Specifically, Ashikaga Yoshimasa was a noted patron of the arts and supported the development of cultural practices that continue to be celebrated today, such as the tea ceremony and no theater. This led to a period of artistic and intellectual growth in Japan, and many of the cultural practices that began during Yoshimasa's reign continue to be celebrated today. However, political power during this period was decentralized, and regional warlords, known as the daimyo, gained and wielded significant influence. This led to frequent conflicts and wars, and the Ashikaga shogunate was often unable to effectively maintain order or prevent violence. As a result, many people during this time lived in a state of uncertainty and insecurity. In the 18th century, when Yoshimasa's Kintsugi story was being documented, Japan had just come through an extended period of extreme internal instability, known as the Sengoku period, or Warring States period. The exact dates of this period are contended, but generally the Japanese people experienced civil war with no formal government structure continuously during the 15th and 16th centuries. During this time, Japan was effectively ruled by a series of powerful daimyo, or feudal lords. Ashikaga Yoshimasa is typically recognized to be the last shogun of the Ashikaga shogunate, which immediately preceded and led into the Sengoku period. Finally, in the year 1600 CE, three powerful daimyos would come together to restore a central government to the country under the Tokugawa shogunate, bringing the chaos of the Sengoku period to an official close and beginning the Edo period in Japan. This period was characterized by a relative degree of peace, economic growth, and further enjoyments of arts and culture. So this gives us some context from the extra-large or wide-angle scale of some factors that were informing Japanese society between the 15th and 18th centuries CE. But what did the combination of these philosophical, socio-political, and natural environments feel like in everyday life? If we take a closer look, we might be able to make stronger inferences about the messaging of Kintsugi legends. As one might predict, the Tokugawa shogunate did not come to power through particularly peaceful means, nor did its reign suddenly mean an end to the dichotomous and uncertain existence of the common people. Peace was largely achieved through strict social order and isolationist foreign policies. Though the Ashikaga shogunate had attempted to establish a looser version of a class-based system in the 15th century, the Tokugawa shogunate implemented a rather extreme version of the Bakufu ideal in order to regain social control following the Sengoku period. This was done with the aid of many Confucian and later Neo-Confucian derived philosophies and principles. Bakufu is the Japanese term for the style of government generally utilized between 1192 and 1868. This intentionally applied a social order known as the Four Divisions of Society, or Shinokosho. In a nutshell, this looked like a shogun at the top of a feudal military government. But more specifically, the system stratified the population and established clear expectations for behavior. A noble figurehead class, including the emperor and kuge, the imperial court, technically existed at the top, but this group had only symbolic power. The few in this category were then supported by an aristocratic military leader and ruling class, which included the shogun, daimyo, and samurai, or shi. Beneath these groups were the chonin, the three townsman classes: farming peasants, no, artisans, ko, and merchants, sho. These people comprised approximately 80% of the population. Though not acknowledged as part of the official social order, society also included Buddhist and Shinto priests who were considered part of the kuge outside of the imperial court. And also still living and participating in the society were an Eda and Hinin group, later known collectively as Burakumin, who were beneath the lower classes and considered untouchables. These were people whose professions broke the taboos of Buddhism, such as undertakers, butchers, executioners, and prostitutes. Also excluded from the societal system were ethnic minorities, those who were not considered Japanese by birth. The Tokugawa shogunate issued many harsh social control edicts to reinforce this system. For example, the Closed Country Edict of 1635 prohibited a Japanese person from traveling outside the country, which was punishable by revocation of their citizenship. Though perhaps having something to do with having been told by a Buddhist monk that he had been a dog in a former life, Tokugawa Tsunayoshi famously decreed that the punishment for harming a dog would be beheading during his reign in the late 17th to early 18th century. And in 1716, a ban was finally lifted on the import of Western books, which was done only to counter an economic depression. Interestingly, the lifting of this ban seems to have preceded Ito Togai's story of Kintsugi, the one featuring Ashikaga Yoshimasa, by only about 10 years. Of course, the Tokugawa shogunate understood that if people are to be effectively controlled, it is not enough to just categorize them according to function in society and inform the people thusly. The individual's everyday living environment must reinforce the behaviors and values that serve society. To this end, according to A Global History of Architecture, in 1603, the first Tokugawa shogun, Ieyasu, decided to rule from a new city, away from Kyoto, the imperial city. Under the Tokugawa, Edo, now Tokyo, became the de facto capital of Japan. They laid out Edo according to all the requisite Confucian-derived principles of imperial master planning. It was conceived as a spiral, though accommodations had to be made for geography. Each class was placed in different sections of the city, known as cho, or city wards, and the populace was not allowed to mingle among classes. The feudal daimyo were located closest to the castle. Lower-ranking samurai were placed in fingers along the spiral as it splayed out from the castle. The chonin, the merchants and artisans, lived in neighborhoods along the outer edges of the city, organized according to their specific occupation. This category would have included those practicing kintsugi. Whether intended by restrictive urban development planning or not, the chonin experienced significant economic success during this period and grew to be a culturally dominant class, particularly compared to the peasant farmer and samurai classes, who during this time were often in debt to members of the chonin. Characterized by conspicuous consumption, this culture led to advances in various science and engineering fields, as well as the development of new art forms such as haiku, poetry, and kabuki. This deeper context helps explain the logic of kintsugi and establishes why it was able to become successful as a practiced art. But kintsugi is really one minor part of a larger cultural body that encompasses a distinct design aesthetic associated with Japan. This aesthetic is also well represented in their distinctive built environment, which we will address next. Kisho Kurokawa, one of the most influential architects in Japan in the 20th century, specifically advocated for understanding Japanese architecture through the wider lens of history. He noted that because most Japanese buildings were historically constructed of timber, Japanese cities were subject to complete obliteration. Kurokawa was specifically referring to destruction incurred during World War II, but more generally, we do not have to look hard to find that this type of destruction was not isolated. In many Japanese coastal towns, one can still find tsunami stones, which were installed to mark the edge of destruction of a previous tsunami, warning future generations not to rebuild beyond that line. Unfortunately, even when future generations observed the warnings of tsunami stones, they could not prevent widespread destruction of homes and public spaces through fire or earthquake. The Japanese had to become accustomed to rebuilding as a result of frequent natural disasters. This led to what Kurokawa described as, quote, an uncertainty about existence, a lack of faith in the visible, a suspicion of the eternal, end quote. As a result, traditional Japanese structures tend to utilize simple materials and feature flexible open floor plans that adapt to the needs of inhabitants with use of movable fixtures such as shoji screens. Conveniently, such an arrangement can be rebuilt relatively quickly and inexpensively as necessary. Emphasis is placed on exterior views, highlighting the changing states of the natural exterior view, rather than featuring ornate detailing or decor. But to look beyond the influences of nature alone on the Japanese built environment, we will return for a moment to Totoyami Hideyoshi's version of Kintsugi in the 16th century. The design of the tea hut that was developing during this period provides clear example of the influence of social ideals, Buddhist thought, and political incentives on architectural design in Japan. During this time, the role of tea master was not only spiritual. Tea masters often acted as political confidants to their shogun or samurai benefactor as well. During the 16th century, largely due to the influence of legendary tea master Sen no Rikyu, they cultivated and recommended the aesthetics of imperfection and insufficiency as their patrons became increasingly tempted to display their growing political power and wealth. Rikyu was the first to introduce several key philosophical aspects to the tea ceremony, such as wabi-sabi. It just so happens that he was patronized by, you guessed it, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Rikyu developed a deep and respectful relationship with Hideyoshi, but he is said to have severely criticized Hideyoshi for his gold-gilded tea hut, not only for its garish uncouthness, but also for its political imprudence, for possibly incurring the wrath of the underprivileged. Subsequently, tea masters further developed the ideals established by Rikyu over the following centuries. Observing an inherent tension between the powerful ruling class and the chonin, tea masters sought to use an aesthetic sensibility to instill the virtue of being satisfied with and finding pleasure in one's lot. Tea masters began building their tea huts to resemble the simple rusticity of a mountain hut. The interior space was made smaller and became less finished. Implemented into the ceremony was a low wash basin and exaggeratedly small entrance, forcing a powerful patron to cast aside his ego, remove his sword, and crawl into the space on hands and knees. And its updated floor plan ensured that there was no obvious spatial center in the tea hut, which obviated the need to formally recognize the social ranking of guests. In addition to forcing psychological balance for a powerful patron who may have fallen victim to self-aggrandizement, the architectural design of Japanese tea houses was also modified to reinforce wabi-sabi. Taken to its logical extreme, wabi reaches its peak of austerity in emptiness. The traditional Japanese tea house includes an alcove called a tokonoma. Tanizaki Junichiro explains the significance of this architectural move in an essay from 1933 titled In Praise of Shadows. Quote, an empty space is marked off with plain wood and plain walls, so that the light drawn into it forms dim shadows within emptiness. There is nothing more. And yet, when we gaze into the darkness that gathers behind the crossbeam, around the flower vase, beneath the shelves, though we know perfectly well it is mere shadow, we are overcome with the feeling that in this small corner of the atmosphere, there reigns complete and utter silence, that here, in the darkness, immutable tranquility holds sway. This was the genius of our ancestors, that by cutting off the light from this empty space, they imparted to the world of shadows that formed there a quality of mystery or depth superior to that of any wall painting or ornament. The technique seemed simple, but was by no means so simply achieved. The philosophical and social ideals that were articulated through the architecture of the tea house persist in Japan's modern-day built environment as well. This demonstrates the depths to which these ideas are indelibly intertwined with their human experience. But what of Kintsugi's role in this complex tapestry? Though not necessarily the case today, perhaps you may have noticed that during the time period in question, the target of Kintsugi was not just any old pottery. If we take a moment to look around at the small scale, we might notice that Kintsugi, quite naturally, shows up specifically in the context of the tea ceremony. In the 16th through the 18th centuries, pottery repaired with this technique would not typically have been available to members of the chonin classes or below. The everyday man would not be taking their evening supper on a delicately repaired plate, replete with gold-dusted veins. But Kintsugi had an important role to play for them, nevertheless. Yuriko Saito notes that the aesthetics of imperfection and insufficiency promoted by the tea ceremony went beyond merely restraining the ostentatious display of wealth and power. It also helped justify insufficiency and poverty through aestheticizing them. The philosophical and religious foundation of this aesthetic did function as a powerful means for justifying life in general for everyone, for the rich and powerful as well as for the poor and humble, end quote. Rikyu is cited in the Namporoku as saying, quote, "In the small tea room, it is desirable for every utensil to be less than adequate. There are those who dislike a piece when it is even slightly damaged. Such an attitude shows a complete lack of comprehension," end quote. Through this lens, we can see that Kintsugi offers itself up as an incredibly powerful narrative tool, supporting an ethos of acceptance towards poverty and insufficiency, and towards uncertainty and imperfection. Through one simple aesthetic, observers instantly grok that although an object may have begun life as common, indeed it becomes more valuable through challenging experiences, when combined with intentional and mindful repair work. So why has Kintsugi shown up in the stories it has? Is, as Marshall McLuhan would say, the medium the message? In the case of Ashikaga Yoshimasa's version, we can learn that the chonin play an important role in society and for the ruling class. This story confers a sense of nationalism to the chonin, developing a sense of pride in Japanese artisanship, trickling down from the pinnacle class. In the case of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's version, we learn that the Buddhist temple plays a crucial role for society as intermediary between the ruling class and chonin classes, encouraging compassion, frugality, and benevolence. In the case of both stories, we see leaders respecting and deferring to Buddhist traditions, like the tea ceremony, modeling minimalism and encouraging sustainable practices. And we also see the full spectrum of classes represented as respecting and appreciating authentic patina, earned through perseverance and creativity. We learn that this society seeks out and finds the sublime residing within the mundane. From the context we have developed from each scale, it is clear that the selection of specific details in the stories told about Kintsugi has not been accidental. The stories of Kintsugi contributed to the maintenance of a relatively peaceful social order in Japan for thousands of years, by nurturing and reinforcing adaptive philosophical and socio-political beliefs for all members of society, irrespective of station. Though not perfectly factual, the stories of Kintsugi have proven themselves more valuable in their state of imperfect truth, making them, in all practicality, more useful even than the technique itself. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. I would like to apologize for my many mispronunciations. I have done the best that I can, though I understand that it is probably like nails on a chalkboard to a native speaker. And my Japanese isn't very good either. Ba-dum-ching. Nope, I do not. Should you have any other excellent questions, please feel free to send them my way or drop me a comment. And as always, a special arigatou gozaimasu to my family for allowing me to dedicate all my focus and attention to crazy projects like this for weeks at a time. If you're still curious about this topic and want to learn more, here's some videos that I highly recommend. Enjoy!